So good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about disability in direct provision and the EU recast Reception Conditions Directive and the importance of building a vulnerability assessment tool. So direct provision is a system in Ireland that has been in place for over 21 years to accommodate and provide basic services for asylum seekers seeking international protection in Ireland. It has been strongly criticised since its beginning in 1999 when it was introduced on an emergency meant to be short-term basis. Conditions within direct provision are argued to very much violate human rights, and many reports and state reports to the state and NGO commentaries on the system have been very critical. For example, the communal living situations, which are very overcrowded. Adults get 80 euros per week, and per child it's 28.80 a week. And in May 2020, the Day report revealed there was 7,700 individuals in the asylum system currently. There are 44 direct provision centres around Ireland, often in remote locations, as well as 33 emergency accommodation centres, which have been used more frequently since the capacity of direct provision has been very full since 2018. And as discussed, the criticisms of the human rights violations continue, with the recent Day report recommending very big changes, as well as an overhaul of how international protection applicants are accommodated going forward. So when referring to disability, I'm using the CRPD non-exhaustive framing of disability. Today is the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, so this is timely. So Article 1 of the CRPD frames it as persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So disability within direct provision is very much a very invisible population group with very little attention paid, either within the mechanisms of the Irish international protection system or disability services within Ireland. All asylum seekers, while the earlier mentions of vulnerability in John's presentation brings up lots of debate, can be argued to be a very vulnerable population due to the pre-mentioned difficult situations that they're living in, often for protracted periods of time in direct provision. And disabled asylum seekers, particularly with additional barriers, would be even more vulnerable. In relation to asylum seekers, Stramer says that persons with disabilities may require particular protection. And disability-related needs are not recognised or accommodated within the system. And it's an area that is going to require a huge amount of activity as changes are brought into how the vulnerability assessment tool hopefully will be developed. There are many access issues, including the direct provision centres themselves being very old buildings, often convents, old hotels, holiday camps that are not accessible to disabled people's needs, and also the remote nature of many of them cause barriers to health and service utilisation for disability services. When talking today about inequality in the panel, we need to look at the intersectional discrimination in relation to discrimination. This group of people will often be coming from many varied traumatic backgrounds. People may have had very much negative experiences of how their disability has been perceived in their home countries. Disability could have happened and been acquired on the transit journey to Ireland. There could have been disability acquired while within direct provision. And if you are a victim of trafficking who's in direct provision, an older disabled person, an unaccompanied minor who has got a disability, who has aged out, if you are a disabled single parent with a child with a disability, or you may have invisible disabilities, multiple disabilities, all of these barriers and extra intersections of discrimination add difficulty to your daily life. And disabled asylum seekers, according to Conte, are at a heightened risk of violence, including domestic violence and discrimination. Mental health is another area that needs to be spoken about, and it could be a whole presentation. Direct provision has been argued to exacerbate mental health difficulties for individuals in direct provision, including child asylum seekers. And there is no data at all collected in relation to disability within the direct provision system since 1999. It is something that really needs to be changed. Ferry asserts that the lack of data in disability reflects the lack of awareness of the issues relating to migration and asylum and within institutions. So when referring to the vulnerability assessment tool in the recast conditions directive, which I'll describe in the next slide, as John had mentioned, vulnerability earlier in his presentation, vulnerability is a contested and very loaded topic, and we need to be aware that the concept is contested and that disability does not necessarily always equate to vulnerability. Currently talking about the RCD, the provision about vulnerability assessments mean that vulnerability is spoken about a lot, but not all disabled people are vulnerable, and that is something that we really need to be clear about. Because of the group-based view of vulnerability that is going to be described in the RCD, there is a worry that it can ascribe vulnerability to all members of a vulnerable group automatically without taking into view the individual context of that person. And so that is something to be very cautious about. And it also obviously has the potential then to reinforce negative stereotypes and additional stigma related to disability. So the Recast Reception Conditions Directive was adopted in the EU in 2013 as part of the Common European Asylum System. Ireland had opted out of the RCD until a very important case in the Irish Supreme Court in 2017, which was the NVH versus the Minister for Justice and Equality and Others case. This Supreme Court case ruled that the absolute prohibition of asylum seekers to work in Ireland was unconstitutional, and Ireland then reformed the law to allow a very limited right to work for asylum seekers. And then they decided to opt into the RCD in full at that stage. Ireland transposed the RCD to legislation called the European Communities Reception Conditions Regulation 2018 on January the 23rd, and it became operational on the 30th of June in 2018. Specifically to disabled people and other vulnerable groups is the obligation to develop a vulnerability assessment tool. Article 2 defines a vulnerable person as who is in need of special guarantee in order to benefit from the rights and comply with obligations provided for in this directive. Article 21 sets out the groups. I won't list them all now because we're short on time. And you can see I've highlighted disabled people there as one of those special vulnerable groups that requires access to a vulnerability assessment tool. So currently, 2 years after transposition of the RCD, unfortunately, there still is no vulnerability assessment tool that has been developed or implemented. The regulations state that vulnerability assessment tool should occur or be available within 30 days of an international protection application being lodged. In December 2009, when Ireland was before the Committee of Elimination of Racial Discriminations Committee for its state review, when questioned by the committee about the vulnerability assessment tool and disabled asylum seekers, the Irish state replied that they would be developing the vulnerability assessment tool in March 2020. However, due to COVID, there may have been a delay. Unfortunately, it has been mentioned previously, and there has not been any implementation to date. And the third concluding observation report in January 2020 recommended the Irish state introduce a comprehensive vulnerability assessment mechanism for early identification of asylum seekers with special needs. And again, COVID-19 exposed the heightened vulnerability of all disabled people everywhere. Certain disabled people will be more predisposed due to certain medical conditions, perhaps, to infection, and COVID-19 is a huge risk depending on your own personal situation health-wise. It also, in direct provision, caused huge distress to the general direct provision community because people couldn't abide with such crowded living situations with the government rules on social distancing, for example, and disabled people were at increased risk as a result of living in direct provision during this pandemic, causing grave concern. So in conclusion, the vulnerability assessment is a legal tool that is a requirement mandated by the transposed legislation. It's not a choice issue, it needs to be developed. Assessment of barriers to identifying disabled people, including invisible disabilities and stigmas that might prevent people from self-disclosing disabilities, such as negative cultural associations. All of those issues need to be taken into account and mapped when developing this vulnerability tool. And the intersectional impacts of inequality and discrimination that disabled asylum seekers face need to be really known and accounted for to be able to be mitigated. It needs to be able to be accessible to the 7,700 asylum seekers currently in the system who have never had a vulnerability assessment undertaken. And it also needs to be available on an ongoing basis so that if people's situations change, or if they weren't in a position at the start when they come to a reception centre before a direct provision centre, that they can do that at a later date. And the disability data collection is very important, that proper best practice data is collected so we know the situation of what disability there are on a level of need, and it may require rapid needs assessments in this really important time when the tool is to be developed. Ireland will also present its first stage report to the CRPD committee in early 2020, and asylum seekers with disabilities are equally involved in CRPD activities and should have the protection of that convention and will need to be accounted for by the state. The optional protocol will be ratified when the state presents its first report, and this will allow for future individual complaints to be made to the committee. A human rights CRPD focus needs to be a key part of the implementation and building of the tool and assessment process the whole way through. And thank you very much for the time. Thank you.